The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. Chapter 8. On the day following our night at the club, we slept until late in the afternoon, so late that beginning of search for work was entirely out of the question. This did not cause me much worry, for I had more than $300, and New York had impressed me as a place where there was lots of money and not much difficulty in getting it. It is needless to inform my readers that I did not long hold this opinion. We got out of the house about dark, went around to a restaurant on 6th Avenue and ate something, then walked around for a couple of hours. I finally suggested that we visit the same places we had been in the night before. Following my suggestion, we started first to the gambling house. The man on the door let us in without any question. I accredited this to my success of the night before. We went straight to the crap room, and I at once made my way to the table, where I was rather flattered by the murmur of recognition which went around. I played in up and down luck for 3 or 4 hours, then, worn with nervous excitement, quit, having lost about $50. But I was so strongly possessed with the thought that I would make up my losses the next time I played that I left that place with a light heart. When we got into the street, our party was divided against itself. 2 were for going home at once and getting to bed. They gave us a reason that we were to get up early and look for jobs. I think the real reason was that they had each lost several dollars in the game. I lived to learn that in the world of sport all men win alike but lose differently. And so gamblers are rated not by the way in which they win, but by the way in which they lose. Some men lose with a careless smile, recognizing that losing is part of the game. Others curse their luck and rail at fortune. And others, still, lose sadly. After each such experience, they are swept by a wave of reform. They resolve to stop gambling and be good. When in this frame of mind, it would take very little persuasion to lead them into a prayer meeting. Those in the first class are looked upon with admiration. Those in the second class are merely commonplace, while those in the third are regarded with contempt. I believe these distinctions hold good in all the ventures of life. After some minutes, one of my friends and I succeeded in convincing the other 2 that a while at the club would put us all in better spirits, and they consented to go on our promise not to stay longer than an hour. We found the place crowded, and the same sort of thing going on which we had seen the night before. I took a seat at once by the side of the piano player and was soon lost to everything else except the novel charm of the music. I watched the performer with the idea of catching the trick, and during one of his intermissions I took his place at the piano and made an attempt to imitate him, but even my quick ear and ready fingers were unequal to the task on first trial. We did not stay at the club very long, but went home to bed in order to be up early the next day. We had no difficulty in finding work, and my 3rd morning in New York found me at a table rolling cigars. I worked steadily for some weeks, at the same time spending my earnings between the crap game and the club. Making cigars became more and more irksome to me. Perhaps my more congenial work as a reader had unfitted me for work at the table, and, too, the late hours I was keeping made such a sedentary occupation almost beyond the powers of will and endurance. I often found it hard to keep my eyes open, and sometimes had to get up and move around to keep from falling asleep. I began to miss whole days from the factory, days on which I was compelled to stay at home and sleep. My luck at the gambling table was varied. Sometimes I was $50 to $100 ahead, and other times I had to borrow money from my fellow workmen to settle my room rent and pay for my meals. Each night after leaving the dice game, I went to the club to hear music and watch the gaiety. If I had won, this was in accord with my mood. If I had lost, it made me forget. I at last realized that making cigars for a living and gambling for a living could not both be carried on at the same time, and I resolved to give up the cigar making. This resolution led me into a life which held me bound more than a year. During that period, my regular time for going to bed was somewhere between 4 and 6 o'clock in the mornings. I got up late in the afternoons, walked about a little, then went on to the gambling house or the club. My New York was limited to 10 blocks. The boundaries were 6th Avenue from 23rd to 33rd Streets, with the cross streets 1 block to the west. Central Park was a distant forest, and the lower park of the city a foreign land. I look back upon the life I then led with a shudder, when I think what would have been had I not escaped it. But had I not escaped it, I would have been no more unfortunate than are many young colored men who come to New York. During that dark period, I became acquainted with a score of bright, intelligent young fellows who had come up to the great city with high hopes and ambitions, and who had fallen under the spell of this underlife, a spell they could not throw off. There was one popularly known as the Doctor. He had had 2 years in the Harvard Medical School, but here he was living this gaslight life, his will and moral sense so enervated and deadened that it was impossible for him to break away. I do not doubt that the same thing is going on now, but I have rather sympathy than censure for these victims, for I know how easy it is to slip into a slough from which it takes a Herculean effort to leap. I regret that I cannot contrast my views of life among colored people of New York, but the truth is, during my entire stay in this city, I did not become acquainted with a single respectable family. I knew that there were several colored men worth $100,000 or so each, and some families who proudly dated their free ancestry back a half a dozen generations. I also learned that in Brooklyn there lived quite a large colony in comfortable homes, most of which they owned. But at no point did my life come in contact with theirs. In my gambling experiences, I passed through all the states and conditions that a gambler is heir to. Some days found me able to peel $10 and $20 bills from a roll, and others found me clad in a linen duster and carpet slippers. I finally caught up another method of earning money, and so did not have to depend entirely upon the caprices of fortune at the gaming table. Though continually listening to the music at the club, and through my own previous training, my natural talent and perseverance, I developed into a remarkable player of ragtime. Indeed, I had the name at that time of being the best ragtime player in New York. I brought all my knowledge of classic music to bear, and in so doing, achieved some novelties which pleased and even astonished my listeners. It was I who first made ragtime transcriptions of familiar classic selections. I used to play Mendelssohn's Wedding March in a manner that never failed to arouse enthusiasm among the patrons of the club. Very few nights passed during which I was not asked to play it. It was no secret that the great increase in slumming visitors was due to my playing. By mastering ragtime, I gained several things. First of all, I gained the title of professor. I was known as the professor as long as I remained in that world. Then, too, I gained the means of earning a rather fair livelihood. This work took up much of my time and kept me almost entirely away from the gambling table. Through it, I also gained a friend, who was the means by which I escaped from this lower world. And finally, I secured a wedge which has opened to me more doors and made me a welcome guest than my playing Beethoven and Chopin could ever have done. The greater part of the money I now began to earn came through the friend to whom I alluded in the foregoing paragraph. Among the other white slummers, there came into the club one night a clean-cut, slender, but athletic-looking man who would have been taken for a youth had it not been for the tinge of gray about his temples. He was clean-shaven, had regular features, and all of his movements bore the indefinable but unmistakable stamp of culture. He spoke to no one, but sat languidly puffing cigarettes and sipping a glass of beer. He was the center of a great deal of attention. All of the old-timers were wondering who he was. When I had finished playing, he called a waiter and by him sent me a $5 bill. For about a month after that, he was at the club 1 or 2 nights each week, and each time after I had played, he gave me $5. One night he sent for me to come to his table. He asked me several questions about myself, then told me that he had an engagement which he wanted me to fill. He gave me a card containing his address and asked me to be there on a certain night. I was on hand promptly, and found that he was giving a dinner in his own apartments to a party of ladies and gentlemen, and that I was expected to furnish the musical entertainment. When the grave, dignified man at the door let me in, the place struck me as being almost dark. My eyes had been so accustomed to the garish light of the club. He took my coat and hat, bade me take a seat, and went to tell his master that I had come. When my eyes were adjusted to the soft light, I saw that I was in the midst of elegance and luxury in such a degree as I had never seen, but not the elegance which makes one ill at ease. As I sank into a great chair, the subdued tone, the delicately sensuous harmony of my surroundings drew from me a deep sigh of relief and comfort. How long the man was gone I do not know, but I was startled by a voice saying, "Come this way, if you please, sir." And I saw him standing by my chair. I had been asleep, and I awoke very much confused and a little ashamed, because I did not know how many times he may have called me. I followed him through into the dining room, where the butler was putting the finishing touches on a table which already looked like a big jewel. The doorman turned me over to the butler, and I passed with the butler on back to where several waiters were busy polishing and assorting table utensils. Without being asked whether I was hungry or not, I was placed at a table and given something to eat. Before I had finished eating, I heard the laughter and talk of the guests who were arriving. Soon afterwards, I was called in to begin my work. I passed in to where the company was gathered and went directly to the piano. According to a suggestion from the host, I began with classic music. During the first number, there was absolute quiet and appreciative attention. And when I had finished, I was given a round of generous applause. After that, the talk and laughter began to grow until the music was only an accompaniment to the chatter. This, however, did not disconcert me, as it once would have done, for I had become accustomed to playing in the midst of uproarious noise. As the guests began to pay less attention to me, I was enabled to pay more to them. There were about a dozen of them. The men ranged in appearance from a girlish-looking youth to a big, grizzled man, whom everybody addressed as Judge. None of the women appeared to be under 30, but each of them struck me as being handsome. I was not long in finding out that they were all decidedly blasé. Several of the women smoked cigarettes, and with a careless grace which showed they were used to the habit. Occasionally a "damn it" escaped from the lips of one of them, but in such a charming way as to rob it of all vulgarity. The most notable thing which I observed was that the reserve of the host increased in direct proportion to the hilarity of his guests. I thought that there was something going wrong which displeased him. I afterwards learned that it was his habitual manner on such occasions. He seemed to take cynical delight in watching and studying others indulging in excess. His guests were evidently accustomed to this rather non-participating attitude, for it did not seem in any degree to dampen their spirits. When dinner was served, the piano was moved and the door left open, so that the company might hear the music while eating. At a word from the host, I struck up one of my liveliest ragtime pieces. The effect was perhaps surprising even to the host. The ragtime music came very near spoiling the party so far as eating the dinner was concerned. As soon as I began, the conversation stopped suddenly. It was a pleasure to me to watch the expression of astonishment and delight that grew on the faces of everybody. These were people, and they represented a large class, who were ever expecting to find happiness and novelty, each day restlessly exploring and exhausting every resource of this great city that might possibly furnish a new sensation or awaken a fresh emotion, and who were always grateful to anyone who aided them in their quest. Several of the women left the table and gathered about the piano. They watched my fingers, asked what kind of music it was that I was playing, where I had learned it, and a host of other questions. It was only by being repeatedly called back to the table that they were induced to finish their dinner. When the guests arose, I struck up my ragtime transcription of Mendelssohn's Wedding March, playing it with terrific chromatic octave runs in the bass. This raised everybody's spirits to the highest point of gaiety, and the whole company involuntarily and unconsciously did an impromptu cakewalk. From that time on until the time of leaving, they kept me so busy that my arms ached. I obtained a little respite when the girlish-looking youth and one or two of the ladies sang several songs. But after each of these it was back to ragtime. In leaving, the guests were enthusiastic in telling the host that he had furnished them the most unique entertainment they had ever enjoyed. When they had gone, my millionaire friend, for he was reported to be a millionaire, said to me with a smile, "Well, I have given them something they've never had before." After I had put on my coat and was ready to leave, he made me take a glass of wine. He then gave me a cigar and $20 in bills. He told me that he would give me lots of work, his only stipulation being that I should not play any engagements such as I had just filled for him, except by his instructions. I readily accepted the proposition, for I was sure that I could not be the loser by such a contract. I afterwards played for him at many dinners and parties of one kind or another. Occasionally he loaned me to some of his friends, and too, I often played for him alone at his apartments. At such times he was quite a puzzle to me, until I became accustomed to his manners. He would sometimes sit for 3 or 4 hours hearing me play, his eyes almost closed, making scarcely a motion except to light a fresh cigarette, and never commenting one way or another on the music. At first I used sometimes to think that he had fallen asleep and would pause in playing. The stopping of the music always aroused him enough to tell me to play this or that, and I soon learned that my task was not to be considered finished until he got up from his chair and said, "That will do." The man's powers of endurance in listening often exceeded mine in performing, yet I am not sure that he was always listening. At times I became so oppressed with fatigue and sleepiness that it took almost superhuman effort to keep my fingers going. In fact, I believe I sometimes did so while dozing. During such moments, this man, sitting there so mysteriously silent, almost hid in a cloud of heavy-scented smoke, filled me with a sort of unearthly terror. He seemed to be some grim, mute, but relentless tyrant, possessing over me a supernatural power which he used to drive me on mercilessly to exhaustion. But these feelings came very rarely. Besides, he paid me so liberally I could forget much. There, at length, grew between us a familiar and warm relationship, and I am sure he had a decided personal liking for me. On my part, I looked upon him at that time as about all a man could wish to be. The club still remained my headquarters, and when I was not playing for my good patron, I was generally to be found there. However, I no longer depended on playing at the club to earn my living. I rather took rank with the visiting celebrities, and occasionally, after being sufficiently urged, would favor my old and new admirers with a new number or two. I say, without any egotistic pride, that among my admirers were several of the best-looking women who frequented the place, and who made no secret of the fact that they admired me as much as they did my playing. Among these was the widow, indeed. Her attentions became so marked that one of my friends warned me to beware of her black companion, who was generally known as a bad man. He said there was much more reason to be careful because the pair had lately quarreled, and had not been together at the club for some nights. This warning greatly impressed me, and I resolved to stop the affair before it should go any further. But the woman was so beautiful that my native gallantry and delicacy would not allow me to repulse her. My finer feelings entirely overcame my judgment. The warning also opened my eyes sufficiently to see that though my artistic temperament and skill made me interesting and attractive to a woman, she was, after all, using me only to excite the jealousy of her companion and revenge herself upon him. It was this surly black despot who held sway over her deepest emotions. One night, shortly afterwards, I went into the club and saw the widow sitting at a table in company with another woman. She at once beckoned for me to come to her. I went, knowing that I was committing worse than folly. She ordered a quart of champagne and insisted that I sit down and drink with her. I took a chair on the opposite side of the table and began to sip a glass of the wine. Suddenly I noticed by an expression on the widow's face that something had occurred. I instinctively glanced around and saw that her companion had just entered. His ugly look completely frightened me. My back was turned to him, but by watching the widow's eyes, I judged that he was pacing back and forth across the room. My feelings were far from comfortable. I expected every moment to feel a blow on my head. She too was very nervous. She was trying hard to appear unconcerned, but could not succeed in hiding her real feelings. I decided that it was best to get out of such a predicament, even at the expense of appearing cowardly, and I made a motion to rise. Just as I partly turned in my chair, I saw the black fellow approaching. He walked directly to our table and leaned over. The widow evidently feared he was going to strike her, and she threw back her head. Instead of striking her, he whipped out a revolver and fired. The first shot went straight into her throat. There were other shots fired, but how many I do not know, for the first knowledge I had of my surroundings and actions was that I was rushing through the chop suey restaurant into the street. Just which street I followed when I got outside I do not know, but I think I must have gone toward 8th Avenue, then down toward 23rd Street, and across toward 5th Avenue. I traveled not by sight, but instinctively. I felt like one fleeing in a horrible nightmare. How long and far I walked I cannot tell. But on 5th Avenue, under a light, I passed a cab containing a solitary occupant who called to me, and I recognized the voice and face of my millionaire friend. He stopped the cab and asked, "What on earth are you doing strolling in this part of town?" For answer, I got into the cab and related to him all that had happened. He reassured me by saying that no charge of any kind could be brought against me, then added, "But of course, you don't want to be mixed up in such an affair." He directed the driver to turn around and go into the park, and then went on to say, "I decided last night that I'd go to Europe tomorrow. I think I'll take you along instead of Walter." Walter was his valet. It was settled that I should go to his apartments for the rest of the night and sail with him in the morning. We drove around through the park, exchanging only an occasional word. The cool air somewhat calmed my nerves, and I lay back and closed my eyes, but still I could see that beautiful white throat with the ugly wound. The jet of blood pulsing from it had placed an indelible red stain on my memory. End of chapter, read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go, on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. Chapter 9. I did not feel at ease until the ship was well out of New York Harbor, and notwithstanding the repeated reassurances of my millionaire friend and my own knowledge of the facts in the case, I somehow could not rid myself of the sentiment that I was, in a great degree, responsible for the widow's tragic end. We had brought most of the morning papers aboard with us, but my great fear of seeing my name in connection with the killing would not permit me to read the accounts. Although in one of the papers I did look at the picture of the victim, which did not in the least resemble her. This morbid state of mind, together with seasickness, kept me miserable for 3 or 4 days. At the end of that time, my spirits began to revive, and I took an interest in the ship, my fellow passengers, and the voyage in general. On the 2nd or 3rd day out, we passed several spouting whales, but I could not arouse myself to make the effort to go to the other side of the ship to see them. A little later, we ran in close proximity to a large iceberg. I was curious enough to get up and look at it, and I was fully repaid for my pains. The sun was shining full upon it, and it glistened like a mammoth diamond, cut with 1,000,000 facets. As we passed it, constantly changed its shapes. At each different angle of vision it assumed new and astonishing forms of beauty. I watched it through a pair of glasses, seeking to verify my early conception of an iceberg. In the geographies of my grammar school days, the pictures of icebergs always included a stranded polar bear, standing desolately upon one of the snowy crags. I looked for the bear, but if he was there, he refused to put himself on exhibition. It was not, however, until the morning that we entered the harbor of Havre that I was able to shake off my gloom. Then the strange sights, the chatter in an unfamiliar tongue, and the excitement of landing and passing the customs officials caused me to forget completely the events of a few days before. Indeed, I grew so light-hearted that when I caught my first sight of the train which was to take us to Paris, I enjoyed a hearty laugh. The toy-looking engine, the stuffy little compartment cars with tiny old-fashioned wheels, struck me as being extremely funny. But before we reached Paris, my respect for our train rose considerably. I found that the tiny engine made remarkable fast time, and that the old-fashioned wheels ran very smoothly. I even began to appreciate the stuffy cars for their privacy. As I watched the passing scenery from the car window, it seemed too beautiful to be real. The bright-colored houses against the green background impressed me as the work of some idealistic painter. Before we arrived in Paris, there was awakened in my heart a love for France, which continued to grow stronger, a love which today makes that country for me the one above all others to be desired. We rolled into the station of Saint-Lazare about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and drove immediately to the Hotel Continental. My benefactor, humoring my curiosity and enthusiasm, which seemed to please him very much, suggested that we take a short walk before dinner. We stepped out of the hotel and turned to the right into the Rue de Rivoli. When the vista of the Place de la Concorde and the Champs-Élysées suddenly burst on me, I could hardly credit my own eyes. I shall attempt no such superoratory task as a description of Paris. I wish only to give briefly the impressions which that wonderful city made upon me. It impressed me as the perfect and perfectly beautiful city. And even after I had been there for some time and seen not only its avenues and palaces, but its most squalid alleys and hovels, this impression was not weakened. Paris became for me a charmed spot, and whenever I have returned there I have fallen under the spell, a spell which compels admiration for all of its manners and customs and justification of even its follies and sins. We walked a short distance up the Champs-Élysées and sat for a while in chairs along the sidewalk, watching the passing crowds on foot and in carriages. It was with reluctance that I went back to the hotel for dinner. After dinner we went to one of the summer theaters, and after the performance my friend took me to a large café on one of the grand boulevards. Here it was that I had my first glimpse of the French life of popular literature, so different from real French life. There were several hundred people, men and women, in the place, drinking, smoking, talking, and listening to the music. My millionaire friend and I took seats at a table where we sat smoking and watching the crowd. It was not long before we were joined by 2 or 3 good-looking, well-dressed young women. My friend talked to them in French and bought drinks for the whole party. I tried to recall my high school French, but the effort availed me little. I could stammer out a few phrases, but very naturally could not understand a word that was said to me. We stayed at the café a couple of hours, then went back to the hotel. The next day we spent several hours in the shops and at the tailor's. I had no clothes, except what I had been able to gather together at my benefactor's apartments the night before we sailed. He bought me the same kind of clothes which he himself wore, and that was the best. And he treated me in every way as he dressed me, as an equal, not as a servant. In fact, I don't think anyone could have guessed that such a relation existed. My duties were light and few, and he was a man full of life and vigor who rather enjoyed doing things for himself. He kept me supplied with money far beyond what ordinary wages would have amounted to. For the first 2 weeks we were together almost constantly, seeing the sights old to him, but from which he seemed to get new pleasure in showing them to me. During the day we took in the places of interest, and at night the theaters and cafes. This sort of life appealed to me as ideal, and I asked him one day how long he intended to stay in Paris. He answered, "Oh, until I get tired of it." I could not understand how that could ever happen. As it was, including several short trips to the Mediterranean, to Spain, to Brussels, or to Ostend, we did remain there 14 or 15 months. We stayed at the Hotel Continental about 2 months of this time. Then my millionaire took apartments, hired a piano, and lived almost the same life he lived in New York. He entertained a great deal, some of the parties being a good deal more blasé than the New York ones. I played for the guests, and all of them with an effect which to relate would be but a tiresome repetition to the reader. I played not only for the guests, but continued, as I used to do in New York, to play often for the host, when he was alone. This man of the world, who grew weary of everything and was always searching for something new, appeared never to grow tired of my music. He seemed to take it as a drug. He fell into a habit which caused me no little annoyance. Sometimes he would come in during the early hours of the morning and, finding me in bed asleep, would wake me up and ask me to play something. This, so far as I can remember, was my only hardship during my whole stay with him in Europe. After the first few weeks spent in sightseeing, I had a great deal of time left to myself. My friend was often I did not know where. When not with him, I spent the day nosing about all the curious nooks and corners of Paris. Of this, I never grew tired. At night, I usually went to some theater, but always ended up at the big café on the grand boulevards. I wish the reader to know that it was not alone the gaiety which drew me there. Aside from that, I had a laudable purpose. I had purchased an English-French conversational dictionary, and I went there every night to take a language lesson. I used to get 3 or 4 of the young women who frequented the place at a table and buy beer and cigarettes for them. In return, I received my lesson. I got more than my money's worth, for they actually compelled me to speak the language. This, together with the reading of the papers every day, enabled me within a few months to express myself fairly well, and, before I left Paris, to have more than an ordinary command of French. Of course, every person who goes to Paris could not dare to learn French in this manner, but I can think of no easier or quicker way of doing it. The acquiring of another foreign language awoke me to the fact that with a little effort I could secure an added accomplishment as fine and as valuable as music. So I determined to make myself as much of a linguist as possible. I bought a Spanish newspaper every day in order to freshen my memory on that language, and for French, devised what was, so far as I knew, an original system of study. I compiled a list which I termed 300 necessary words. These I thoroughly committed to memory. Also, the conjugation of the verbs which were included in the list. I studied these words over and over, much like children of a couple of generations ago studied the alphabet. I also practiced a set of phrases like the following. How? What did you say? What does the word mean? I understand what you say, except... Please repeat. What do you call... How do you say... These I called my working sentences. In an astonishingly short time I reached the point where the language taught itself, where I learned to speak merely by speaking. This point is the place which students taught foreign languages in our schools and colleges find great difficulty in reaching. I think the main trouble is that they learn too much of a language at a time. A French child with a vocabulary of 200 words can express more spoken ideas than a student of French can with a knowledge of 2,000. A small vocabulary, the smaller the better, which embraces the common everyday used ideas, thoroughly mastered, is the key to a language. When that much is acquired, the vocabulary can be increased simply by talking, and it is easy. Who cannot commit 300 words to memory? Later I tried my method, if I so may term it, with German, and found that it worked in the same way. I spent a good many evenings at the Grand Opera. The music there made me strangely reminiscent of my life in Connecticut. It was an atmosphere in which I caught a fresh breath of my boyhood days and early youth. Generally, in the morning, after I had attended a performance, I would sit at the piano and for a couple of hours play the music which I used to play in my mother's little parlor. One night, I went to hear Faust. I got into my seat just as the lights went down for the first act. At the end of the act 1, I noticed that my neighbor on the left was a young girl. I cannot describe her either as to feature color of her hair or of her eyes. She was so young, so fair, so ethereal, that I felt to stare at her would be a violation, yet I was distinctly conscious of her beauty. During the intermission, she spoke English in a low voice to a gentleman and lady who sat in the seats to her left, addressing them as father and mother. I held my program as though studying it, but listened to each and every sound of her voice. Her observations on the performance and the audience were so fresh and naive as to be almost amusing. I gathered that she was just out of school and that this was her first trip to Paris. I occasionally stole a glance at her, and each time I did so my heart leaped into my throat. Once I glanced beyond to the gentleman who sat next to her. My glance immediately turned into a stare. Yes, there he was. Unmistakably. My father. Looking hardly a day older than when I had seen him some 10 years before. What a strange coincidence. What should I say to him? What would he say to me? Before I had recovered from my first surprise, there came another shock and the realization that the beautiful, tender girl at my side was my sister. Then all the springs of affection in my heart, stopped since my mother's death, burst out in fresh and terrible torrents, and I could have fallen at her feet and worshipped her. They were singing the second act, but I did not hear the music. Slowly, the desolate loneliness of my position became clear to me. I knew that I could not speak, but I would have given a part of my life to touch her hand with mine and call her sister. I sat through the opera until I could stand it no longer. I felt that I was suffocating. Valentine's love seemed like mockery, and I felt an almost uncontrollable impulse to rise up and scream to the audience, Here in your very midst is a tragedy, a real tragedy. This impulse grew so strong that I became afraid of myself, and in the darkness of one of the scenes I stumbled out of the theater. I walked aimlessly about for an hour or so, my feelings divided between a desire to weep and a desire to curse. I finally took a cab and went from cafe to cafe, and for one of the very few times in my life, drank myself into a stupor. It was unwelcome news for me when my benefactor, I could not think of him as employer, informed me that he was at last tired of Paris. This news gave me, I think, a passing doubt as to his sanity. I had enjoyed life in Paris and, taking all things into consideration, enjoyed it wholesomely. One thing which greatly contributed to my enjoyment was the fact that I was an American. Americans are immensely popular in Paris, and this is not due solely to the fact that they spend lots of money there, for they spend just as much or more in London, and in the latter city they are merely tolerated because they do spend. The Londoner seems to think that Americans are people whose only claim to be classed as civilized is that they have money, and the regrettable thing about that is that the money is not English. But the French are more logical and freer from prejudices than the British, so the difference of attitude is easily explained. Only once in Paris did I have cause to blush for my American citizenship. I had become quite friendly with a young man from Luxembourg, whom I had met at the big cafe. He was a stolid, slow-witted fellow, but, as we say, with a heart of gold. He and I grew attached to each other and were together frequently. He was a great admirer of the United States and never grew tired of talking to me about the country and asking for information. It was his intention to try his fortune there some day. One night he asked me in a tone of voice which indicated that he expected an authoritative denial of an ugly rumor. Did they really burn a man alive in the United States? I never knew what I stammered out to him as an answer. I should have felt relieved if I could have even said to him, Well, only one. When we arrived in London, my sadness at leaving Paris was turned into despair. After my long stay in the French capital, huge, ponderous, massive London seemed to me as ugly a thing as man could contrive to make. I thought of Paris as a beauty spot on the face of the earth, and of London as a big freckle. But soon London's massiveness, I might say its very ugliness, began to impress me. I began to experience that sense of grandeur which one feels when he looks at a great mountain or a mighty river. Beside London, Paris becomes a toy, a pretty plaything. And I must own that, before I left the world's metropolis, I discovered much there that was beautiful. The beauty in and about London is entirely different from that in and about Paris. And I could not but admit that the beauty of the French city seemed handmade, artificial, as though set up for the photographer's camera. Everything nicely adjusted so as not to spoil the picture, while that of the English city was rugged, natural, and fresh. How these two cities typify the two peoples who built them. Even the sound of their names express a certain racial difference. Paris is the concrete expression of the gaiety, regard for symmetry, love of art, and, I might well add, of the morality of the French people. London stands for the conservatism, the solidarity, the utilitarianism, and I might well add the hypocrisy of the Anglo-Saxon. It may sound odd to speak of the morality of the French, if not of the hypocrisy of the English. But this seeming paradox impressed me as a deep truth. I saw many things in Paris which were immoral according to English standards, but the absence of hypocrisy, the absence of the spirit to do the right thing if it might only be done in secret, robed these very immoralities of the damning influence of the same evils in London. I have walked along the terrace cafes of Paris and seen hundreds of men and women sipping their wine and beer without observing a sign of drunkenness. As they drank, they chatted and laughed and watched the passing crowds. The drinking seemed to be a secondary thing. This I have witnessed not only in the cafes along the grand boulevards, but in the out-of-way places patronized by the working classes. In London I have seen in the pubs men and women crowded in stuffy little compartments, drinking seemingly only for the pleasure of swallowing as much as they could hold. I have seen there women from 18 to 80, some in tatters and some clutching babies in their arms, drinking the heavy English ales and whiskies served to them by women. In the whole scene not one ray of brightness, not one flash of gaiety, only maudlin joviality or grim despair. And I have thought, if some men and women will drink, and it is certain that some will, is it not better that they do so under the open sky and the fresh air than huddled together in some close, smoky room? There is a sort of frankness about the evils of Paris which robs them of much of the seductiveness of things forbidden, and with that frankness goes a certain cleanliness of thought belonging to things not hidden. London will do whatever Paris does, provided exterior morals are not shocked. As a result, Paris has the appearance only of being the more immoral city. The difference may be summed up in this. Paris practices its sins as lightly as it does its religion, while London practices both very seriously. I should not neglect to mention what impressed me most forcibly during my stay in London. It was not St. Paul's, nor the British Museum, nor Westminster Abbey. It was nothing more or less than the simple phrase, "Thank you," or sometimes more elaborated, "Thank you very kindly, sir." I was continually surprised by the varied uses to which it was put. And, strange to say, its use as an expression of politeness seemed more limited than any other. One night I was in a cheap music hall and accidentally bumped into a waiter who was carrying a tray-load of beer, almost bringing him to several shillings' worth of grief. To my amazement, he righted himself and said, "Thank you, sir," and left me wondering whether he meant that he had thanked me for not completely spilling his beer, or that he would thank me for keeping out of his way. I also found cause to wonder upon what ground the English accuse Americans of corrupting the language by introducing slang words. I think I heard more and more different kinds of slang during my few weeks in London than in my whole tenderloin life in New York. But I suppose the English feel that the language is theirs, and that they may do with it as they please without at the same time allowing that privilege to others. My millionaire was not so long in growing tired of London as of Paris. After a stay of 6 or 8 weeks, we went across into Holland. Amsterdam was a great surprise to me. I had always thought of Venice as the city of canals, but it had never entered my mind that I should find similar conditions in a Dutch town. I don't suppose the comparison goes far beyond the fact that there are canals in both cities. I've never seen Venice, but Amsterdam struck me as being extremely picturesque. From Holland we went to Germany, where we spent 5 or 6 months, most of the time in Berlin. I found Berlin more to my taste than London, and occasionally I had to admit that in some things it was superior to Paris. In Berlin I especially enjoyed the orchestral concerts, and I attended a large number of them. I formed the acquaintance of a good many musicians, several of whom spoke of my playing in high terms. It was in Berlin that my inspiration was renewed. One night, my millionaire entertained a party of men composed of artists, musicians, writers, and, for aught I know, a count or two. They drank and smoked a great deal, talked art and music, and discussed, it seemed to me, everything that had ever entered man's mind. I could only follow the general drift of what they were saying. When they discussed music, it was more interesting to me, for then some fellow would turn excitedly to the piano and give a demonstration of his opinions, and another would follow quickly doing the same. In this way I learned that regardless of what his specialty might be, every man in the party was a musician. I was at the same time impressed with the falsity of the general idea that Frenchmen are excitable and emotional, and that Germans are calm and phlegmatic. Frenchmen are merely gay and never overwhelmed by their emotions. When they talk loud and fast, it's merely talk, while Germans get worked up and red in the face when sustaining an opinion, and in heated discussions are likely to allow their emotions to sweep them off their feet. My millionaire planned in the midst of the discussion on the music to have me play the new American music and astonish everybody present. The result was that I was more astonished than anyone else. I went to the piano and played the most intricate ragtime piece I knew. Before there was time for anybody to express an opinion on what I had done, a big, bespectacled, bushy-headed man rushed over and, shoving me out of the chair, exclaimed, "Get up! Get up!" He seated himself at the piano and, taking the theme of my ragtime, played it through first in straight chords, then varied and developed it through every known musical form. I sat amazed. I had been turning classic music into ragtime, a comparatively easy task, and this man had taken ragtime and made it classic. The thought came across me like a flash. It can be done. Why can't I do it? From that moment my mind was made up. I clearly saw the way of carrying out the ambition I had formed when a boy. I now lost interest in our trip. I thought, here I am, a man, no longer a boy, and what am I doing but wasting my time and abusing my talent? What use am I making of my gifts? What future have I before me, following my present course? These thoughts made me feel remorseful, and put me in a fever to get to work, to begin to do something. Of course, I know now that I was not wasting time, that there was nothing I could have done at that age which would have benefited more than going to Europe as I did. The desire to begin work grew stronger each day, and I could think of nothing else. I made up my mind to go back into the very heart of the South, to live among the people and drink in my inspiration firsthand. I gloated over the immense amount of material I had to work with, not only modern ragtime, but also the old slave songs, material which no one had yet touched. The more decided and anxious I became to return to the United States, the more I dreaded the ordeal of breaking with my millionaire. Between this peculiar man and me there had grown a very strong bond of affection, backed up by a debt which each owed to the other. He had taken me from a terrible life in New York and giving me the opportunity of traveling and of coming in contact with the people with whom he was associated, had made me a polished man of the world. On the other hand, I was his chief means of disposing of the thing which seemed to sum up all in life that he dreaded: time. As I remember him now, I can see that time was what he was always endeavoring to escape, to bridge over, to blot out. And it is not strange that some years later he did escape it forever, by leaping into eternity. For some weeks, I waited for just the right moment in which to tell my patron of my decision. Those weeks were a trying time to me. I felt that I was playing the part of a traitor to my best friend. At length, one day he said to me, "Well, get ready for a long trip. We're going to Egypt and then to Japan." The temptation was, for an instant, almost overwhelming, but I summoned determination enough to say, "I don't think I want to go." "What?" he exclaimed. "You want to go back to your dear Paris? You still think that's the only spot on earth? Wait till you see Cairo and Tokyo. You may change your mind." "No," I stammered. "It is not because I want to go back to Paris. I want to go back to the United States." He wished to know my reason, and I told him as best I could my dreams, my ambition, and my decision. While I was talking, he watched me with a curious, almost cynical smile growing on his lips. When I had finished, he put his hand on my shoulder. This was the first physical expression of tender regard he had ever shown me, and looking at me in a big brotherly way, he said, "My boy, you are by blood, by appearance, by education, and by tastes, a white man." Now why do you want to throw your life away amidst the poverty and ignorance in the hopeless struggle of the black people of the United States? Then look at the terrible handicap you are placing on yourself by going home and working as a Negro composer. You can never be able to get the hearing of your work which it might deserve. I doubt that even a white musician of recognized ability could succeed by working on the theory that American music should be based on Negro themes. Music is a universal art. Anybody's music belongs to everybody. You can't limit it to race or country. Now, if you want to become a composer, why not stay right here in Europe? I will put you under the best teachers on the continent. Then if you want to write music on Negro themes, why, go ahead and do it. We talked for some time on music and the race question. On the latter subject I had never before heard him express any opinion. Between him and me, no suggestion of racial differences had ever come up. I found that he was a man entirely free from prejudice, but he recognized that prejudice was a big, stubborn entity which had to be taken into account. He went on to say, "This idea you have of making a Negro out of yourself is nothing more than a sentiment, and you do not realize the fearful import of what you intend to do. What kind of a Negro would you make now, especially in the South? If you had remained there, or perhaps even in your club in New York, you might have succeeded very well, but now you would be miserable. I can imagine no more dissatisfied human being than an educated, cultured, and refined colored man in the United States. I have given more study to the race question in the United States than you may suppose, and I sympathize with the Negroes there. But what's the use? I can't right their wrongs, and neither can you. They must do that themselves. They are unfortunate in having wrongs to right, and you would be foolish to unnecessarily take their wrongs on your shoulders. Perhaps some day, through study and observation, you will come to see that evil is a force, and like the physical and chemical forces, we cannot annihilate it. We may only change its form. We light upon one evil and hit it with all the might of our civilization, but only succeed in scattering it into a dozen other forms. We hit slavery through a great civil war. Did we destroy it? No. We only changed it into a hatred between sections of the country. In the South, into political corruption and chicanery. The degradation of the blacks through peonage, unjust laws, unfair and cruel treatment, and the degradation of the whites by their resorting to these practices. The paralyzation of the public conscience, and the ever-overhanging dread of what the future may bring. Modern civilization hit ignorance on the masses through the means of popular education. What has it done to turn ignorance into anarchy, socialism, strikes, hatred between poor and rich, and universal discontent? In like manner, modern philanthropy hit at suffering and disease through asylums and hospitals. It prolongs the sufferers' lives, it is true, but is at the same time sending down strains of insanity and weakness into future generations. My philosophy of life is this: make yourself as happy as possible, and try to make those happy whose lives come into touch with yours. But to attempt to right the wrongs that ease the sufferings of the world in general is a waste of effort. You had just as well tried to bail the Atlantic by pouring the water into the Pacific. This tremendous flow of serious talk from a man I was accustomed to see either gay or taciturn so surprised and overwhelmed me that I could not frame a reply. He left me thinking over what he had said. Whatever was the soundness of his logic or the moral tone of his philosophy, his argument greatly impressed me. I could see, in spite of the absolute selfishness upon which it was based, that there was reason and common sense in it. I began to analyze my own motives and found that they, too, were very largely mixed with selfishness. Was it more a desire to help those I considered my people, or more a desire to distinguish myself, which was leading me back to the United States? That is a question I have never definitively answered. For several weeks longer I was in a troubled state of mind. Added to the fact that I was loath to leave my good friend was the weight of the question he had aroused in my mind, whether I was not making a fatal mistake. I suffered more than one sleepless night during that time. Finally, I settled the question on purely selfish grounds, in accordance with my millionaire's philosophy. I argued that music offered me a better future than anything else I had any knowledge of, and in opposition to my friend's opinion, that I should have greater chances of attracting attention as a colored composer than as a white one. But I must own that I also felt stirred by an unselfish desire to voice all the joys and sorrows, the hopes and ambitions of the American Negro in classic musical form. When my mind was fully made up, I told my friend. He asked me when I intended to start. I replied that I would do so at once. He then asked me how much money I had. I told him that I had saved several $100s out of sums he had given me. He gave me a check for $500 and told me to write to him, care of his Paris bankers, if I ever needed his help. Wished me good luck and bade me goodbye. All this he did almost coldly, and I often wondered whether he was in a hurry to get rid of what he considered a fool, or whether he was striving to hide deeper feelings of sorrow. And so I separated from a man who was, all in all, the best friend I ever had, except my mother, the man who exerted the greatest influence ever brought into my life, except that exerted by my mother. My affection for him was so strong, my recollections of him are so distinct, he was such a peculiar and striking character, that I could easily fill several chapters with reminiscences of him. But for fear of tiring the reader, I shall go on with my narration. I decided to go to Liverpool and take ship for Boston. I still had an uneasy feeling about returning to New York, and in a few days I found myself aboard a ship headed for home. End of chapter. Read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. Chapter 10. Among the first of my fellow passengers of whom I took any particular notice was a tall, broad-shouldered, almost gigantic colored man. His dark brown face was clean-shaven. He was well-dressed and bore a decidedly distinguished air. In fact, if he was not handsome, he at least compelled admiration for his fine physical proportions. He attracted general attention as he strode the deck in sort of majestic loneliness. I became curious to know who he was and determined to strike up an acquaintance with him at the first opportune moment. The chance came a day or two later. He was sitting in the smoking room with a cigar in his mouth which had gone out, reading a novel. I sat down beside him and, offering him a fresh cigar, said, "You don't mind my telling you something unpleasant, do you?" He looked at me with a smile, accepted the proffered cigar, and replied in a voice which comported perfectly with his size and appearance, "I think my curiosity overcomes any objections I might have." "Well," I said, "have you noticed that the man who sat at your right in the saloon during the first meal has not sat there since?" He frowned slightly without answering my question. "Well," I continued, "he asked the steward to remove him. And not only that, he attempted to persuade a number of the passengers to protest against your presence in the dining saloon." The big man at my side took a long draw from his cigar, threw his head back, and slowly blew a great cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. Then turning to me, he said, "Do you know I don't object to anyone having prejudices, so long as those prejudices don't interfere with my personal liberty. Now the man you are speaking of had a perfect right to change his seat, if I in any way interfered with his appetite or his digestion. I would have no reason to complain if he removed to the farthest corner of the saloon, or even if he got off the ship. But when his prejudice attempts to move me 1 foot, 1 inch out of the place where I am comfortably located, then I object." On the word object, he brought his great fist down on the table in front of us with such a crash that everyone in the room turned to look. We both covered up this slight embarrassment with a laugh and strolled out on the deck. We walked the deck for about an hour or more, discussing different phases of the Negro question. I, in referring to the race, used the personal pronoun we. My companion made no comment about it, nor evinced any surprise, except to slightly raise his eyebrows the first time he caught the significance of the word. He was the broadest-minded colored man I have ever talked with on the Negro question. He even went so far as to sympathize with and offer excuses for some white Southern points of view. I asked him what were his main reasons for being so hopeful. He replied, "In spite of all that is written, said, and done, this great, big, incontrovertible fact stands out. The Negro is progressing, and that disproves all the argument in the world that he is incapable of progress. I was born in slavery, and at emancipation was set adrift a ragged, penniless bit of humanity. I have seen the Negro in every grade, and I know what I am talking about. Our detractors point to the increase of crime as evidence against us. Certainly we have progressed in crime, as in other things. What less could be expected? And yet, in this respect, we are far from the point which has been reached by the more highly civilized white race. As we continue to progress, crime among us will gradually lose much of its brutal, vulgar, I might say healthy aspect, and become more delicate, refined, and subtle. Then it will be less shocking and noticeable, although more dangerous to society." Then, dropping his tone of irony, he continued with some show of eloquence, "But above all, when I am discouraged and disheartened, I have this to fall back on. If there is a principle of right in the world which finally prevails, and I believe that there is if there is a merciful but justice-loving God in heaven, and I believe that there is, we shall win. For we have right on our side, while those who oppose us can defend themselves by nothing in the moral law, not even by anything in the enlightened thought of the present age." For several days, together with other topics, we discussed the race problem, not only in the United States, but the race problem as it affected native Africans and Jews. Finally, before we reached Boston, our conversation had grown familiar and personal. I had told him something of my past and much about my intentions for the future. I learned that he was a physician, a graduate of Howard University, Washington, and had done postgraduate work in Philadelphia, and this was his second trip abroad to attend professional courses. He had practiced for some years in the city of Washington, and though he did not say so, I gathered that his practice was a lucrative one. Before we left the ship, he had made me promise that I would stop 2 or 3 days in Washington before going south. We put up at a hotel in Boston for a couple of days and visited several of my new friends' acquaintances. They were all people of education and culture and, apparently, of means. I could not but help being struck by the great difference between them and the same class of colored people in the South. In speech and thought, they were genuine Yankees. The difference was especially noticeable in their speech. There was none of that heavy-tongued enunciation which characterizes even the best educated colored people of the South. It is remarkable, after all, what an adaptable creature the Negro is. I have seen the black West India gentleman in London, and he is, in speech and manners, a perfect Englishman. I have seen natives of Haiti and Martinique in Paris, and they are more French than any Frenchman. I have no doubt that the Negro would make a good Chinaman, with the exception of the pigtail. My stay in Washington, instead of being 2 or 3 days, was 2 or 3 weeks. This was my first visit to the national capital, and I was, of course, interested in seeing the public buildings and something of the working of the government. But most of my time I spent with the doctor among his friends and acquaintances. The social phase of life among colored people, which I spoke of in an earlier chapter, is more developed in Washington than in any other city in the country. This is on account of the large number of individuals earning good salaries and having a reasonable amount of leisure time to be drawn from. There are dozens of physicians and lawyers, scores of school teachers, and hundreds of clerks in the departments. As to the colored department clerks, I think it is fair to say that in educational equipment they average above the white clerks of the same grade. For, whereas a colored college graduate will seek such a job, the white university man goes into one of the many higher vocations which are open to him. In a previous chapter, I spoke of social life among colored people, so there is no need to take it up here. But there is one thing I did not mention. Among Negroes themselves, there is the peculiar inconsistency of a color question. Its existence is rarely admitted and hardly ever mentioned. It may not be too strong a statement to say that the greater portion of the race is unconscious of its influence. Yet this influence, though silent, is constant. It is evidenced most plainly in marriage selection. Thus, the black men generally marry women fairer than themselves, while on the other hand, the dark women of stronger mental endowment are very often married to light-complexioned men. The effect is a tendency toward lighter complexions, especially among the more active elements in the race. Some might claim that this is a tacit admission of colored people among themselves of their own inferiority judged by the color line. I do not think so. What I have termed an inconsistency is, after all, most natural. It is in fact a tendency in accordance with what might be called an economic necessity. So far as racial differences go, the United States puts a greater premium on color, or better, lack of color, than upon anything else in the world. To paraphrase, have a white skin, and all things else may be added unto you. I have seen advertisements in newspapers for waiters, bellboys, or elevator men which read, "Light-colored man wanted." It is this tremendous pressure which the sentiment of the country exerts that is operating on the race. There is involved not only the question of higher opportunity, but often the question of earning a livelihood. And so I say it is not strange, but a natural tendency. Nor is it any more a sacrifice of self-respect than a black man should give to his children every advantage he can, which complexion of the skin carries, than that the new or vulgar rich should purchase for their children the advantages which ancestry, aristocracy, and social position carry. I once heard a colored man sum it up in these words: "It's no disgrace to be black, but it's often very inconvenient." Washington shows the Negro not only at his best, but also at his worst. As I drove around with the doctor, he commented rather harshly on those of the latter class which we saw. He remarked, "You see those lazy, loafing, good-for-nothing darkies? They're not worth digging graves for. Yet they are the ones who create impressions of the race for the casual observer. It's because they are always in evidence on the street corners, while the rest of us are hard at work. And you know a dozen loafing darkies make a bigger crowd and a worse impression in this country than 50 white men of the same class. But they ought not to represent the race. We are the race, and the race ought to be judged by us, not by them. Every race and every nation is judged by the best it has been able to produce, not by the worst." The recollection of my stay in Washington is a pleasure to me now. In company with the doctor, I visited Howard University, the public schools, the excellent colored hospital, with which he was in some way connected, if I remember correctly, and many comfortable and even elegant homes. It was with some reluctance that I continued my journey south. The doctor was very kind in giving me letters to people in Richmond and Nashville, when I told him that I intended to stop in both of these cities. In Richmond, a man who was then editing a very creditable colored newspaper gave nigh a great deal of his time and made my stay there of 3 or 4 days very pleasant. In Nashville, I spent a whole day at Fisk University, the home of the Jubilee Singers, and was more than repaid for my time. Among my letters of introduction was one to a very prosperous physician. He drove me about the city and introduced me to a number of people. From Nashville I went to Atlanta, where I stayed long enough to gratify an old desire to see Atlanta University again. I then continued my journey to Macon. During the trip from Nashville to Atlanta, I went into the smoking compartment of the car to smoke a cigar. I was traveling in a Pullman, not because of an abundance of funds, but because through my experience with my millionaire, a certain amount of comfort and luxury had become a necessity to me whenever it was obtainable. When I entered the car, I found only a couple of men there, but in a half hour there were half a dozen or more, From the general conversation, I learned that a fat, Jewish-looking man was a cigar manufacturer and was experimenting in growing Havana tobacco in Florida. That a slender and bespectacled young man was from Ohio and a professor in some state institution in Alabama. That a white-mustached, well-dressed man was an old Union soldier who had fought through the Civil War, and that a tall, raw-boned, red-faced man who seemed bent on leaving nobody in ignorance of the fact that he was from Texas was a cotton planter. In the North, men may ride together for hours in a smoker, and unless they are acquainted with each other, never exchange a word. In the South, men thrown together in such manner are friends in 15 minutes. There is always present a warm-hearted cordiality which will melt down the most frigid reserve. It may be because Southerners are very much like Frenchmen in that they must talk. And not only must they talk, but they must express their opinions. The talk in the car was for a while miscellaneous, on the weather, crops, business prospects. The old Union soldier had invested capital in Atlanta, and he predicted that all that city would soon be one of the greatest in the country. Finally, the conversation drifted to politics, then, as a natural sequence, turned upon the Negro question. In the discussion of the race question, the diplomacy of the Jew was something to be admired. He had the faculty of agreeing with everybody without losing his allegiance to any side. He knew that to sanction Negro oppression would be to sanction Jewish oppression, and would expose him to a shot along that line from the old soldier who stood firmly on the ground of equal rights and opportunity to all men. Yet, long traditions and business instincts told him, when in Rome, to act as a Roman. Altogether his position was a delicate one, and I gave him credit for the skill he displayed in maintaining it. The young professor was apologetic. He had the same views as the GAR man, but a year in the South had opened his eyes, and he had to confess that the problem could hardly be handled any better than it was being handled by the Southern whites. To which the GAR man responded somewhat rudely that he had spent 10 times as many years in the South as his young friend, and that he could easily understand how holding a position in a state institution in Alabama would bring about a change of views. The professor turned very red and had very little more to say. The Texan was fierce, eloquent, and profane in his argument, and in a lower sense, there was a direct logic in what he said, which was convincing. It was only by taking higher ground, by dealing in what Southerners call theories, that he can be combated. Occasionally, some one of the several other men in the smoker would throw in a remark to reinforce what he said, but he really didn't need any help. He was sufficient in himself. In the course of a short time, the controversy narrowed itself down to an argument between the old soldier and the Texan. The latter maintained hotly that the Civil War was a criminal mistake on the part of the North, and that the humiliation which the South suffered during Reconstruction could never be forgotten. The Union man retorted just as hotly that the South was responsible for the war, and that the spirit of unforgetfulness on its part was the greatest cause of present friction, and that it seemed to be the one great aim of the South to convince the North that the latter made a mistake in fighting to preserve the Union and liberate the slaves. Can you imagine, he went on to say, what would have been the condition of things eventually if there had been no war and the South had been allowed to follow its course? Instead of one great prosperous country with nothing before it but the conquests of peace, a score of petty republics, as in Central and South America, wasting their energies in war with each other or in revolutions. Well, replied the Texan, anything, no country at all, is better than having niggers over you. But anyhow, the war was fought, and the niggers were freed. For it's no use beating around the bush. The niggers and not the Union was the cause of it. And now do you believe that all the niggers on earth are worth the good white blood that was spilt? You freed the nigger and you gave him the ballot, but you couldn't make a citizen out of him. He don't know what he's voting for, and we buy 'em like so many hogs. You're giving 'em education, but that only makes slick rascals out of 'em. Don't fancy for a moment, said the northern man, that you have any monopoly in buying ignorant votes. The same thing is done on a larger scale in New York and Boston, and in Chicago and San Francisco, and they're not black votes either. As to education making the Negro worse, you had just as well tell me that religion does the same thing. And by the way, how many educated color men do you know personally? The Texan admitted that he knew only one, and added that he was in a penitentiary. But, he said, do you mean to claim ballot or no ballot, education or no education, that niggers are equals of all white men? That's not the question, answered the other. But if the Negro is so distinctly inferior, it is a strange thing to me that it takes such tremendous effort on the part of the white man to make him realize it, and to keep him in the same place into which inferior men naturally fall. However, let us grant for the sake of argument that the Negro is inferior in every respect to the white man. That fact only increases our moral responsibility in regard to our action toward him. Inequalities of numbers, wealth, and power, even of intelligence and morals, should make no difference in the essential rights of men. If he is inferior and weaker and is shoved to the wall, that's his own lookout, said the Texan. That's the law of nature, and he's bound to go to the wall, for no race in the world has ever been able to stand competition with the Anglo-Saxon. The Anglo-Saxon race has always been and always will be the masters of the world, and the niggers in the South ain't going to change all the records of history. My friend, said the old soldier slowly, if you have studied history, will you tell me, as confidentially between white men, what the Anglo-Saxon has ever done? The Texan was too much astonished by the question to venture any reply. His opponent continued, Can you name a single one of the great fundamental and original intellectual achievements which have raised man in the scale of civilization that may be credited to the Anglo-Saxon? The art of letters, of poetry, of music, of sculpture, of painting, of the drama, of architecture, the science of mathematics, of astronomy, of philosophy, of logic, of physics, of chemistry, the use of the metals and the principles of mechanics, were all invented or discovered by darker and what we now call inferior races and nations. We have carried many of these to their highest point of perfection, but the foundation was laid by others. Do you know the only original contribution to civilization we can claim is what we have done in steam and electricity, and in making implements of war more deadly? And there we worked largely on principles which we did not discover. Why, we didn't even originate the religion we use. We are a great race, the greatest in the world today, but we ought to remember that we are standing on a pile of past races, and enjoy our position with a little less show of arrogance. We are simply having our turn at the game, and we were a long time getting to it. After all, racial supremacy is merely a matter of dates in history. The man here who belongs to what is, all in all, the greatest race in the world ever produced, is almost ashamed to own it. If the Anglo-Saxon is the source of everything good and great in the human race from the beginning, why wasn't the German forest the birthplace of civilization? The Texan was somewhat disconcerted, for the argument had passed a little beyond his limits, but he swung it back to where he was sure his ground by saying, All that may be true, but it hasn't got much to do with us and the niggers here in the South. We've got 'em here, and we've got 'em to live with, and it's a question of white man or nigger, no middle ground. You want us to treat niggers as equals? Do you want to see 'em sitting around in our parlors? Do you want to see a mulatto South? To bring it right home to you, would you let your daughter marry a nigger? No, I wouldn't consent to my daughter marrying a nigger. But that doesn't prevent my treating a black man fairly. And I don't see what fair treatment has to do with niggers sitting around in your parlors. They can't come there unless they're invited. Out of all the white men I know, only 100 or so have the privilege of sitting around in my parlor. As to the mulatto South, if you Southerners have one boast that is stronger than another, it is your women. You put them on a pinnacle of purity and virtue and bow down in a chivalric worship before them. Yet you talk and act as though, should you treat the Negro fairly and take the anti-intermarriage laws off your statute books, these same women would rush into the arms of black lovers and husbands. It's a wonder to me that they don't rise up and resent the insult. "Colonel," said the Texan, as he reached into his handbag and brought out a large flask of whiskey, "you might argue from now until hell freezes over, and you might convince me that you're right, but you'll never convince me that I'm wrong. All you say sounds very good, but it's got nothing to do with facts. You can say what men ought to be, but they ain't that. So there you are. Down here in the South, we're up against facts, and we're meeting 'em like facts. We don't believe the nigger is or ever will be the equal of the white man, and we ain't going to treat him as an equal. I'll be damned if we will. Have a drink." Everybody, except the professor, partook of the generous Texan's flask, and the argument closed in a general laugh and good feeling. I went back into the main part of the car with the conversation on my mind. Here I had before me the bald, raw, naked aspects of the race question in the South, and in consideration of the step I was just taking, it was far from encouraging. The sentiments of the Texan, and he expressed the sentiments of the South, fell upon me like a chill. I was sick at heart. Yet I must confess that underneath it all I felt a certain sort of admiration for the man who could not be swayed from what he held as his principles. Contrasted with him, the young Ohio professor was indeed a pitiable character, and all along, in spite of myself, I have been compelled to accord the same kind of admiration to the Southern white man for the manner in which he defends not only his virtues but his vices. He knows that, judged by a high standard, he is narrow and prejudiced, that he is guilty of unfairness, oppression, and cruelty, but this he defends as stoutly as he would his better qualities. This same spirit obtains in a great degree among the blacks. They too defend their faults and failings. This spirit carries them so far at times as to make them sympathizers with members of their race who are perpetrators of crime, and yet, among themselves, they are their own most merciless critics. I have never heard the race so terribly arraigned as I have by colored speakers to strictly colored audiences. It is the spirit of the South to defend everything belonging to it. The North is too cosmopolitan and tolerant for such a spirit. If you should say to an Easterner that Paris is a gayer city than New York, he would be likely to agree with you, or at least to let you have your way. But to suggest to a South Carolinian that Boston is a nicer city to live in than Charleston would be to stir his greatest depths of argument and eloquence. But today, as I think over that smoking car argument, I can see it in a different light. The Texan's position does not render things so hopeless, for it indicates that the main difficulty of the race question does not lie so much in the actual condition of the blacks as it does in the mental attitude of the whites. And a mental attitude, especially one not based on truth, can be changed more easily than actual conditions. That is to say, the burden of the question is not that the whites are struggling to save 10 million despondent and moribund people from sinking into a hopeless slough of ignorance, poverty, and barbarity in their very midst, but that they are unwilling to open certain doors of opportunity and to accord certain treatment to 10 million aspiring education and poverty-acquiring people. In a word, the difficulty of the problem is not so much due to the facts presented as to the hypothesis assumed for its solution. In this, it is similar to the problem of the solar system. By a complex, confusing, and almost contradictory mathematical process, by the use of zigzags instead of straight lines, the Earth can be proven to be the center of things celestial. but by an operation so simple that it can be comprehended by a schoolboy, its position can be verified among the other worlds which revolve about the sun, and its movements harmonize with the laws of the universe. So, when the white race assumes as a hypothesis that it is the main object of creation and that all things else are merely subsidiary to its well-being, sophism, subterfuge, perversion of conscience, arrogance, injustice, oppression, cruelty, sacrifice of human blood, all are required to maintain the position, and its dealings with other races become indeed a problem which, if based on a hypothesis of common humanity, could be solved by the simple rules of justice. When I reached Macon, I decided to leave my trunk and all my surplus belongings, to pack my bag, and strike out into the interior. This I did, and by train, by mule and ox cart, I traveled through many counties. This was my first real experience among rural colored people, and all that I saw was interesting to me. But there was a great deal which does not require description at my hands, for log cabins and plantations and dialect-speaking darkies are perhaps better known in American literature than any other single picture of our national life. Indeed, they form an ideal and exclusive literary concept of the American Negro to such an extent that it is almost impossible to get the reading public to recognize him in any other setting. But I shall endeavor to avoid giving the reader any already overworked and hackneyed descriptions. This generally accepted literary ideal of the American Negro constitutes what is really an obstacle in the way of the thoughtful and progressive element of the race. His character has been established as a happy-go-lucky, laughing, shuffling, banjo-picking being, and the reading public has not yet been prevailed upon to take him seriously. His efforts to elevate himself socially are looked upon as a sort of absurd caricature of white civilization. A novel dealing with colored people who lived in respectable homes and amidst a fair degree of culture and who naturally acted just like white folks would be taken in a comic opera sense. In this respect, the Negro is much in the position of a great comedian who gives up the lighter roles to play tragedy. No matter how well he may portray the deeper passions, the public is loth to give him up in his old character. They even conspire to make him a failure in serious work in order to force him back into comedy. In that same respect, the public is not too much to be blamed, for great comedians are far more scarce than mediocre tragedians. Every amateur actor is a tragedian. However, this very fact constitutes the opportunity of the future Negro novelist and poet to give the country something new and unknown in depicting the life, the ambitions, the struggles, and the passions of those of their race who are striving to break the narrow limits of traditions. A beginning has already been made in that remarkable book by Dr. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. Much, too, that I saw while on this trip, in spite of my enthusiasm, was disheartening. Often I thought of what my millionaire had said to me and wished myself back in Europe. The houses in which I had to stay were generally uncomfortable, sometimes worse. I often had to sleep in a division or compartment with several other people. Once or twice I was not so fortunate as to find divisions. Everybody slept on pallets on the floor. Frequently I was able to lie down and contemplate the stars, which were in their zenith. The food was at times so distasteful and poorly cooked that I could not eat it. I remember that once I lived for a week or more on buttermilk on account of not being able to stomach the fat bacon, the rank turnip tops, and the heavy damp mixture of meal, salt, and water, which was called cornbread. It was only my ambition to do the work which I had planned that kept me steadfast to my purpose. Occasionally I would meet with some signs of progress, an uplift in even one of these backward settlements. Houses built on boards with windows and divided into rooms, decent food and a fair standard of living. This condition was due to the fact that there was in the community some exceptionally capable Negro farmer whose thrift served as an example. As I went about among these dull, simple people, the great majority of them hard-working, and their relations with the whites submissive, faithful, and often affectionate, negatively content with their lot, and contrasted them with those of the race who had been quickened by the forces of thought. I could not but appreciate the logic of the position held by those Southern leaders who have been bold enough to proclaim against the education of the Negro. They are consistent in their public speech with Southern sentiment and desires. Those public men of the South who have not been daring or heedless enough to defy the ideals of 20th century civilization and of modern humanitarianism and philanthropy find themselves in the embarrassing situation of preaching one thing and praying for another. They are in the position of the fashionable woman who is compelled by the laws of polite society to say to her dearest enemy, "How happy I am to see you." And yet, in this respect, how perplexing is Southern character. For in opposition to the above, it may be said that the claim of the Southern whites that they love the Negro better than the Northern whites do is in a manner true. Northern white people love the Negro in a sort of abstract way, as a race. Through a sense of justice, charity, and philanthropy, they will liberally assist in his elevation. A number of them have heroically spent their lives in this effort, and just here I wish to say that when the colored people reach the monument-building stage, they should not forget the men and women who went south after the war and founded schools for them. Yet, generally speaking, they have no particular liking for individuals of the race. Southern white people despise the Negro as a race and will do nothing to aid in his elevation as such. But for certain individuals, they have a strong affection and are helpful to them in many ways. With these individual members of the race, they live on terms of the greatest intimacy. They entrust to them their children, their family treasures, and their family secrets. In trouble, they often go to them for comfort and counsel. In sickness, they often rely upon their care. This affectionate relation between the Southern whites and those blacks who come into close touch with them has not been overdrawn, even in fiction. This perplexity of Southern character extends even to the mixture of the races. That is spoken of as though it were dreaded worse than smallpox, leprosy, or the plague. Yet, when I was in Jacksonville, I knew several prominent families there with large colored branches, which went by the same name and were known and acknowledged as blood relatives. And what is more, there seemed to exist between these black brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts a decided friendly feeling. I said above that Southern whites would do nothing for the Negro as a race. I know the South claims that it has spent millions for the education of the blacks, and that it has, on its own free will, shouldered this awful burden. It seems to be forgetful of the fact that these millions have been taken from the public tax funds for education, and that the law of political economy, which recognizes the landowner as the one who really pays the taxes, is not tenable. It would be just as reasonable for the relatively few landowners of Manhattan to complain that they had to stand the financial burden of the education of the thousands and thousands of children whose parents pay rent for tenements and flats. Let the millions of producing and consuming Negroes be taken out of the South, and it would be quickly seen how much less of public funds there would be to appropriate for education or any other purpose. In thus traveling about through the country, I was sometimes amused on arriving at some little railroad station town to be taken for and treated as a white man, and 6 hours later, when it was learned that I was stopping at the house of a colored preacher or school teacher, to note the attitude of the whole town change. At times, this led even to embarrassment. Yet it cannot be so embarrassing for a colored man to be taken for white as for a white man to be taken for colored, and I have heard of several cases of the latter kind. All this while I was gathering material for work, jotting down in my notebook themes and melodies, and trying to catch the spirit of the Negro in his relatively primitive state. I began to feel the necessity of hurrying so that I might get back to some city like Nashville to begin my compositions, and at the same time earn at least a living by teaching and performing before my funds gave out. At the last settlement in which I stopped, I found a mine of material. This was due to the fact that Big Meeting was in progress. Big Meeting is an institution something like camp meeting, the difference being that it is held in a permanent church and not in a temporary structure. All the churches of some one denomination, of course, either Methodist or Baptist, in a county or perhaps in several adjoining counties, are closed, and the congregations unite at some centrally located church for a series of meetings lasting a week. It is really a social as well as a religious function. The people come in great numbers, making the trip according to their financial status in buggies drawn by sleek, fleet-footed mules, in ox teams, or on foot. It was amusing to see some of the latter class trudging down the hot and dusty road with their shoes, which were brand new, strung across their shoulders. When they got near the church, they sat on the side of the road, and with many grimaces, tenderly packed their feet into those instruments of torture. This furnished, indeed, a trying test of their religion. The famous preachers come from near and far and take turns in warning sinners of the day of wrath. Food, in the form of those two southern luxuries, fried chicken and roast pork, is plentiful, and no one need go hungry. On the opening Sunday, the women are immaculate, in starched, stiff white dresses, adorned with ribbons either red or blue. Even a great many of the men wear streamers of van-colored ribbons in the buttonholes of their coats. A few of them carefully cultivate a forelock of hair by wrapping it in twine, and on such festive occasions decorate it with a narrow ribbon streamer. Big meetings afford a fine opportunity to the younger people to meet each other dressed in their Sunday clothes, and much rustic courting, which is as enjoyable as any other kind, is indulged in. This big meeting, which I was lucky enough to catch, was particularly well attended. The extra-large attendance was due principally to two attractions. A man by the name of John Brown, who was renowned as the most powerful preacher for miles around, and a wonderful leader of singing who was known as Singing Johnson. These two men were a study and a revelation to me. They caused me to reflect upon how great an influence their types have in the development of the Negro in America. Both these types are now looked upon generally with condescension or contempt by the progressive element among the colored people. But it should be never forgotten that it was they who led the race from paganism and kept it steadfast to Christianity through all the long, dark years of slavery. John Brown was a jet black man of medium size, with a strikingly intelligent head and face, and a voice like an organ peal. He preached each night after several lesser lights successively held the pulpit during an hour or so. As far as subject matter is concerned, all of the sermons were alike. Each began with the fall of man, ran through various trials and tribulations of the Hebrew children, unto the redemption by Christ, and ended with the fervid picture of the judgment day and the fate of the damned. But John Brown possessed magnetism and an imagination so free and daring that he was able to carry through what other preachers would not attempt. He knew all the arts and tricks of oratory, the modulation of the voice to almost a whisper, the pause for effect, the rise through light, rapid-fire sentences to the terrific, thundering outburst of an electrifying climax. In addition, he had the intuition of a born theatrical manager. Night after night, this man held me fascinated. He convinced me that, after all, eloquence consists more in the manner of saying than in what is said. It is largely a matter of tone pictures. The most striking example of John Brown's magnetism and imagination was his Heavenly March. I shall never forget how it impressed me when I heard it. He opened his sermon in the usual way, then proclaiming to his listeners that he was going to take them on the heavenly march, he seized the Bible under his arm and began to pace up and down the pulpit platform. The congregation immediately began with their feet a tramp, tramp, tramp in time with the preacher's march in the pulpit, all the while singing in an undertone a hymn about marching to Zion. Suddenly he cried, "Halt!" Every foot stopped with the precision of a company of well-drilled soldiers, and the singing ceased. The morning star had been reached. Here the preacher described the beauties of that celestial body. Then the march, the tramp, 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 and the singing was again taken up. Another halt! They had reached the evening star, and so on, past the sun and the moon, the intensity of religious emotion all the time increasing, along the Milky Way on up to the gates of heaven. Here the halt was longer, and the preacher described at length the gates and walls of the New Jerusalem. Then he took his hearers through the pearly gates, along the golden streets, pointing out the glories of the city, pausing occasionally to greet some patriarchal members of the church, well known to most of his listeners in life, who had had the tears wiped from their eyes, were clad in robes of spotless white, with crowns of gold upon their heads and harps within their hands, and ended his march before the great white throne. To the reader this may sound ridiculous, but listened to under the circumstances, it was highly and effectively dramatic. I was a more or less sophisticated and non-religious man of the world, but the torrent of the preacher's words, moving with the rhythm and glowing with the eloquence of primitive poetry, swept me along, and I too felt like joining in the shouts of "Amen! Hallelujah!" John Brown's powers in describing the delights of heaven were no greater than those in depicting the horrors of hell. I saw great, strapping fellows trembling and weeping like children at the mourner's bench. His warnings to sinners were truly terrible. I shall never forget one expression that he used, which, for originality and aptness, could not be excelled. In my opinion, it is more graphic and, for us, far more expressive than St. Paul's, "It is hard to kick against the pricks." He struck the attitude of a pugilist and thundered out, "Young man, your arm's too short to box with God." As interesting as was John Brown to me, the other man singing Johnson was more so. He was a small, dark brown, one-eyed man, with a clear, strong, highly pitched voice, a leader of singing, a maker of songs, a man who could improvise at the moment lines to fit the occasion. Not so striking a figure as John Brown, but, at big meetings, equally important. It is indispensable to the success of the singing, when the congregation is a large one made up of people from different communities, to have someone with a strong voice who knows just what hymn to sing and when to sing it, who can pitch it in the right key, and who has all the leading lines committed to memory. Sometimes it devolves upon the leader to sing down a long-winded or uninteresting speaker. Committing to memory the leading lines of all the Negro spiritual songs is no easy task, for they run up into the hundreds. But the accomplished leader must know them all, because the congregation sings only the refrains and repeats. Every ear in the church is fixed upon him, and if he becomes mixed in his lines or forgets them, the responsibility falls directly on his shoulders. For example, most of these hymns are constructed to be sung in the following manner. Leader. Swing low, sweet chariot. Congregation. Coming forth to carry me home. Leader. Swing low, sweet chariot. Congregation. Coming forth to carry me home. Leader. I look over yonder. What do I see? Congregation. Coming forth to carry me home. Leader. Two little angels coming after me. Congregation. Coming forth to carry me home, etc. The solitary and plaintive voice of the leader is answered by a sound like the roll of the sea, producing a most curious effect. In only a few of these songs do the leader and the congregation start off together. Such a song is the well-known "Steal Away to Jesus." The leader and the congregation begin, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. Then the leader alone, my Lord, he calls me. He called me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. Then all together, I ain't got long to stay here. The leader and the congregation again take up the opening refrain. Then the leader sings 3 more leading lines alone, and so on, almost ad infinitum. It will be seen that even before most of the work falls upon the leader, for the congregation sings the same lines over and over, while his memory and ingenuity are taxed to keep the songs going. Generally, the parts taken up by the congregation are sung in a 3-part harmony, the women singing the soprano and a transposed tenor, the men with high voices singing the melody, and those with low voices a thundering bass. In a few of these songs, however, the leading part is sung in unison by the whole congregation down to the last line, which is harmonized. The effect of this is intensely thrilling. Such a hymn is Go Down Moses. It stirs the heart like a trumpet call. Singing Johnson was an ideal leader, and his services were in great demand. He spent his time going about the country from one church to another. He received his support in much the same way as preachers, part of the collection, food, and lodging. All of his leisure time he devoted to originating new words and melodies and new lines for old songs. He always sang with his eyes, or to be more exact, his eye closed, indicating the tempo by swinging his head to and fro. He was a great judge of the proper hymn to sing at a particular moment, and I noticed several times when the preacher reached a certain climax or expressed a certain sentiment that Johnson broke in with a line or two of some appropriate hymn. The preacher understood and would pause until the singing ceased. As I listened to the singing of these songs, the wonder of their production grew upon me more and more. How did the men who originated them manage to do it? The sentiments are easily accounted for. They are mostly taken from the Bible, but the melodies, where did they come from? Some of them so weirdly sweet and others so wonderfully strong. Take, for instance, Go Down Moses. I doubt that there is a stronger theme in the whole musical literature of the world, and so many of these songs contain more than mere melody. There is sounded in them that elusive undertone, the note in music which is not heard with the ears. I sat often with the tears rolling down my cheeks, and my heart melted within me. Any musical person who has never heard a Negro congregation, under the spell of religious fervor, sing these old songs, has missed one of the most thrilling emotions which the human heart may experience. Anyone who can listen to Negroes sing, "Nobody knows the trouble I see, nobody knows but Jesus," without shedding tears, must indeed have a heart of stone. And yet, the Negroes themselves do not fully appreciate these old slave songs. The educated classes are rather ashamed of them and prefer to sing hymns from books. This feeling is natural. They are still too close to the conditions under which the songs were produced. But the day will come when this slave music will be the most treasured heritage of the American Negro. At the close of the big meeting, I left the settlements where it was being held full of enthusiasm. I was in that frame of mind which, in the artistic temperament, amounts to inspiration. I was now ready and anxious to get to some place where I might settle down to work and give expression to the ideas which were teeming in my head. But I strayed into another deviation from my path of life, as I had it marked out, which led me into an entirely different road. Instead of going to the nearest and most convenient railroad station, I accepted the invitation of a young man who had been present the closing Sunday at the meeting to drive with him some miles farther to the town in which he taught school, and there take my train. My conversation with this young man as we drove along through the country was extremely interesting. He had been a student in one of the Negro colleges, strange coincidence, in the very college, as I learned through him, in which Shiny was now a professor. I was, of course, curious to hear about my boyhood friend, and had it not been vacation time, and that I was not sure that I would find him, I should have gone out of my way to pay him a visit. But I determined to write to him as soon as the school opened. My companion talked to me about his work among the people, of his hopes and his discouragements. He was tremendously in earnest. I might say too much so. In fact, it may be said that the majority of intelligent colored people are, in some degree, too much in earnest over the race question. They assume and carry so much that their progress is at times impeded, and they are unable to see things in their proper proportions. In many instances, a slight exercise of the sense of humor would save much anxiety of soul. Anyone who marks the general tone of editorials in colored newspapers is apt to be impressed with this idea. If the mass of Negroes took their present and future as seriously as do most of their leaders, the race would be in no mental condition to sustain the terrible pressure which it undergoes. It would sink of its own weight. Yet, it must be acknowledged that in the making of a race, over-seriousness is a far lesser failing than its reverse, and even the faults resulting from it lean toward the right. We drove into the town just before dark. As we passed a large unpainted church, my companion pointed it out as the place where he held his school. I promised that I would go there with him the next morning and stay a while. The town was of that kind which hardly requires or deserves description. A straggling line of brick and wooden stores on one side of the railroad track, and some cottages of various sizes on the other side, constituted about the whole of it. The young schoolteacher boarded at the best house in the place, owned by a colored man. It was painted, had glass windows, contained store-bought furniture, an organ, and lamps with chimneys. The owner held a job of some kind on the railroad. After supper, it was not long before everybody was sleepy. I occupied the room with the schoolteacher. In a few minutes after we got into the room, he was in bed and asleep. But I took advantage of the unusual luxury of a lamp which gave light, and sat looking over my notes and jotting down some ideas which were still fresh in my mind. Suddenly I became conscious of that sense of alarm which is always aroused by the sound of hurrying footsteps on the silence of the night. I stopped work and looked at my watch. It was after 11. I listened, straining every nerve to hear above the tumult of my quickening pulse. I caught the murmur of voices, then the gallop of a horse, then another and another. Now thoroughly alarmed, I awoke my companion, and together we both listened. After a moment, he put out the light, softly opened the window blind, and we cautiously peeped out. We saw men moving in one direction, and from the mutterings we vaguely caught the rumor that some terrible crime had been committed. Murder, rape. I put on my coat and hat. My friend did all in his power to dissuade me from venturing out, but it was impossible for me to remain in the house under such tense excitement. My nerves would not have stood it. Perhaps what bravery I exercised in going out was due to the fact that I felt sure of my identity as a colored man had not yet become known in the town. I went out, and following the drift, reached the railroad station. There was gathered there a crowd of men, all white, and others were steadily arriving, seemingly from all the surrounding country. How did the news spread so quickly? I watched these men moving under the yellow glare of the kerosene lamps about the station, stern, comparatively silent, all of them armed, some of them in boots and spurs, fierce, determined men. I had come to know the type well, blond, tall and lean, with ragged mustache and beard, and glittering gray eyes. At the first suggestion of daylight, they began to disperse in groups going in several directions. There was no extra noise or excitement, no loud talking, only swift, sharp words of command given by those who seemed to be accepted as leaders by mutual understanding. In fact, the impression made upon me was that everything was being done in quite an orderly manner. In spite of so many leaving, the crowd around the station continued to grow. At sunrise, there were a great many women and children. By this time, I also noticed some colored people. A few seemed to be going about customary tasks. Several were standing on the outskirts of the crowd, but the gathering of Negroes usually seen in such towns was missing. Before noon, they brought him in. 2 horsemen rode abreast. Between them, half dragged, the poor wretch made his way through the dust. His hands were tied behind him, and ropes around his body were fastened to the saddle horns of his double guard. The men who at midnight had been stern and silent were now emitting that terror-instilling sound known as the rebel yell. A space was quickly cleared in the crowd, and a rope placed about his neck. When from somewhere came the suggestion, "Burn him," it ran like an electric current. Have you ever witnessed the transformation of human beings into savage beasts? Nothing can be more terrible. A railroad tie was sunk into the ground. The rope was removed, and a chain brought and securely coiled around the victim and the stake. There he stood, a man only in form and stature, every sign of degeneracy stamped upon his countenance. His eyes were dull and vacant, indicating not a single ray of thought. Evidently the realization of his fearful fate had robbed him of whatever reasoning power he had ever possessed. He was too stunned and stupefied even to tremble. Fuel was brought from everywhere. Oil, the torch. The flames crouched for an instant, as though to gather strength, then leaped up as high as their victim's head. He squirmed, he writhed, strained at his chains, then gave out cries and groans that I shall always hear. The cries and groans were choked off by the fire and smoke, but his eyes, bulging from their sockets, rolled from side to side, appealing in vain for help. Some of the crowd yelled and cheered. Others seemed appalled at what they had done, and there were those who turned away, sickened at the sight. I was fixed to the spot where I stood, powerless to take my eyes from what I did not want to see. It was over before I realized that time had elapsed, before I could make myself believe that what I saw was really happening. I was looking at a scorched post, a smoldering fire, blackened bones, charred fragments sifting down through coils of chain, and the smell of burnt flesh, human flesh, was in my nostrils. I walked a short distance away and sat down in order to clear my dazed mind. A great wave of humiliation and shame swept over me. Shame that I belonged to a race that could be so dealt with, and shame for my country, that it, the great example of democracy to the world, should be the only civilized, if not the only state on earth, where a human being would be burned alive. My heart turned bitter within me. I could understand why Negroes are led to sympathize with even their worst criminals, and to protect them when possible. By all the impulses of normal human nature, they can and should do nothing less. Whenever I hear protests from the South that it should be left alone to deal with the Negro question, my thoughts go back to that scene of brutality and savagery. I do not see how a people that can find in its conscience any excuse whatever for slowly burning to death a human being, or to tolerate such an act, can be entrusted with the salvation of a race. Of course, there are in the South men of liberal thought who do not approve lynching, but I wonder how long they will endure the limits which are placed upon free speech. They still cower and tremble before Southern opinion. Even so late as the recent Atlanta riot, those men who were brave enough to speak a word in behalf of justice and humanity felt called upon by way of apology to preface what they said with a glowing rhetorical tribute to the Anglo-Saxons' superiority, and to refer to the great and impassable gulf between the races fixed by the Creator at the foundation of the world. The question of the relative qualities of the two races is still an open one. The reference to the great gulf loses force in face of the fact that there are in this country perhaps 3 or 4 million people with the blood of both races in their veins. But I fail to see the pertinency of either statement, subsequent to the beating and murdering of scores of innocent people in the streets of a civilized and Christian city. The Southern whites are in many respects a great people. Looked at from a certain point of view, they are picturesque. If one will put himself in a romantic frame of mind, he can admire their notions of chivalry and bravery and justice. In this same frame of mind, an intelligent man can go to the theater and applaud the impossible hero, who with his single sword slays everybody in the play except the equally impossible heroine. So can an ordinary peace-loving citizen sit by a comfortable fire and read with enjoyment of the bloody deeds of pirates and the fierce brutality of Vikings. This is the way in which we gratify the old underlying animal instincts and passions, but we should shudder with horror at the mere idea of such practices being realities in this day of enlightened and humanitarianized thought. The Southern whites are not yet living quite in the present age. Many of their general ideas hark back to a former century, some of them to the Dark Ages. In the light of other days, they are sometimes magnificent. Today, they are often ludicrous and cruel. How long I sat with bitter thoughts running through my mind, I do not know. Perhaps an hour or more. When I decided to get up and go back to the house, I found that I could hardly stand on my feet. I was as weak as a man who has lost blood. However, I dragged myself along with the central idea of a general plan well fixed in my mind. I did not find my schoolteacher friend at home, so did not see him again. I swallowed a few mouthfuls of food, packed my bag, and caught the afternoon train. When I reached Macon, I stopped only long enough to get the main part of my luggage and to buy a ticket for New York. All along the journey I was occupied in debating with myself the step which I had decided to take. I argued that to forsake one's race to better one's condition was no less worthy an action than to forsake one's country for the same purpose. I finally made up my mind that I would neither disclaim the black race nor claim the white race, but that I would change my name, raise a mustache, and let the world take me for what it would. That it was not necessary for me to go about with a label of inferiority pasted across my forehead. All the while I understood that it was not discouragement or fear or search for a larger field of action and opportunity that was driving me out of the Negro race. I knew that it was shame, unbearable shame. Shame at being identified with a people that could with impunity be treated worse than animals. For certainly the law would restrain and punish the malicious burning alive of animals. So once again I found myself gazing at the towers of New York and wondering what future that city held in store for me. End of chapter, read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man by James Weldon Johnson. Chapter 11. I have now reached that part of my narrative where I must be brief and touch only lightly on important facts. Therefore the reader must make up his mind to pardon skips and jumps and meager details. When I reached New York, I was completely lost. I could not have felt more a stranger had I been suddenly dropped into Constantinople. I knew not where to turn or how to strike out. I was so oppressed by a feeling of loneliness that the temptation to visit my old home in Connecticut was well nigh irresistible. I reasoned, however, that unless I found my old music teacher, I should be, after so many years of absence, as much of a stranger there as in New York, and furthermore, that in view of the step which I had decided to take, such a visit would be injudicious. I remembered, too, that I had some property there in the shape of a piano and a few books, but decided that it would not be worth what it might cost me to take possession. By reason of the fact that my living expenses in the South had been very small, I still had nearly $400 of my capital left. In contemplation of this, my natural and acquired bohemian tastes asserted themselves, and I decided to have a couple of weeks' good time before worrying seriously about the future. I went to Coney Island and the other resorts, took in the pre-season shows along Broadway, and ate at first-class restaurants, but I shunned the old Sixth Avenue district as though it were pest-infected. My few days of pleasure made appalling inroads upon what cash I had, and caused me to see that it required a good deal of money to live in New York as I wished to live, and that I should have to find very soon some more or less profitable employment. I was sure that, unknown, without friends or prestige, it would be useless to try to establish myself as a teacher of music, so I gave that means of earning a livelihood scarcely any consideration. And even had I considered it possible to secure pupils, as I then felt, I should have hesitated about taking up a work in which the chances for any considerable financial success are necessarily so small. I had made up my mind that since I was not going to be a Negro, I would avail myself of every possible opportunity to make a white man's success, and that, if it can be summed up in any one word, means money. I watched the want columns in the newspapers and answered a number of advertisements, but in each case found the positions were such as I could not fill or did not want. I also spent several dollars for ads, which brought me no replies. In this way I came to know the hopes and disappointments of a large and pitiable class of humanity in this great city, the people who look for work through the newspapers. After some days of this sort of experience, I concluded that the main difficulty with me was that I was not prepared for what I wanted to do. I then decided upon a course which, for an artist, showed an uncommon amount of practical sense and judgment. I made up my mind to enter a business college. I took a small room, ate at lunch counters in order to economize, and pursued my studies with the zeal that I have always been able to put into any work upon which I set my heart. Yet, in spite of all my economy, when I had been at the school for several months, my funds gave out completely. I reached the point where I could not afford sufficient food for each day. In this plight, I was glad to get through one of the teachers a job as an ordinary clerk in a downtown wholesale house. I did my work faithfully and received a raise of salary before I expected it. I even managed to save a little money out of my modest earnings. In fact, I began then to contract the money fever, which later took strong possession of me. I kept my eyes open, watching for a chance to better my condition. It finally came in the form of a position with a house, which was at the time establishing a South American department. My knowledge of Spanish was, of course, the principal cause of my good luck, and it did more for me. It placed me where the other clerks were practically put out of competition with me. I was not slow in taking advantage of the opportunity to make myself indispensable to the firm. What an interesting and absorbing game is money-making. After each deposit at my savings bank, I used to sit and figure out all over again my principal and interest, and make calculations on what the increase would be in such and such a time. Out of this I derived a great deal of pleasure. I denied myself as much as possible in order to swell my savings. Even so much as I enjoyed smoking, I limited myself to an occasional cigar, and that was generally of a variety which in my old days at the club was known as a Henry Mudd. Drinking I cut out altogether, but that was no great sacrifice. The day on which I was able to figure up $1,000 marked an epoch in my life, and this was not because I had never before had money. In my gambling days, and while I was with my millionaire, I handed sums running high up into the hundreds, but they had come to me like fairy godmother's gifts, and at that time when my conception of money was that it was made only to spend. Here, on the other hand, was $1,000 which I had earned by days of honest and patient work. $1,000 which I had carefully watched grow from the first dollar, and I experienced in owning them a pride, a satisfaction which to me was an entirely new sensation. As my capital went over the $1,000 mark, I was puzzled to know what to do with it, how to put it to the most advantageous use. I turned down first one scheme and then another, as though they had been devised for the sole purpose of gobbling up my money. I finally listened to a friend who advised me to put all I had in New York real estate, and under his guidance I took equity in a piece of property on which stood a rickety old tenement house. I did not regret following this friend's advice, for in something like 6 months I disposed of my equity for more than double my investment. From that time on, I devoted myself to the study of New York real estate and watched for opportunities to make similar investments. In spite of 2 or 3 speculations which did not turn out well, I have been remarkably successful. Today I am the owner and part owner of several flat houses. I have changed my place of employment 4 times since returning to New York, and each change has been a decided advancement. Concerning the position which I now hold, I shall say nothing except that it pays extremely well. As my outlook on the world grew brighter, I began to mingle in the social circles of the men with whom I came in contact, and gradually, by a process of elimination, I reached a grade of society of no small degree of culture. My appearance was always good, and my ability to play on the piano, especially ragtime, which was then at the height of its vogue, made me a welcome guest. The anomaly of my social position often appealed strongly to my sense of humor. I frequently smiled inwardly at some remark not altogether complimentary to people of color, and more than once I felt like declaiming, "I am a colored man. Do I not disprove the theory that 1 drop of Negro blood renders a man unfit?" Many a night when I returned to my room after an enjoyable evening, I laughed heartily over what struck me as the capital joke I was playing. Then I met her, and what I had regarded as a joke was gradually changed into the most serious question of my life. I first saw her at a musical which was given one evening at a house to which I was frequently invited. I did not notice her among the other guests before she came forward and sang 2 sad little songs. When she began, I was out in the hallway where many of the men were gathered, but with the first few notes I crowded with the others into the doorway to see who the singer was. When I saw the girl, the surprise which I had felt at the first sound of her voice was heightened. She was almost tall and quite slender, with lustrous yellow hair and eyes so blue as to appear almost black. She was as white as a lily, and she was dressed in white. Indeed, she seemed to me the most dazzlingly white thing I had ever seen. But it was not her delicate beauty which attracted me most, it was her voice. A voice which made one wonder how tones of such passionate color could come from such a fragile body. I determined that when the program was over I would seek an introduction to her. But at that moment, instead of being the easy man of the world, I became again the bashful boy of 14, and my courage failed me. I contented myself with hovering as near her as politeness would permit, near enough to hear her voice, which in conversation was low yet thrilling, like the deeper middle tones of a flute. I watched the men gather around her talking and laughing in an easy manner, and wondered how it was possible for them to do it. But destiny, my special destiny, was at work. I was standing near, talking with affected gaiety to several young ladies who, however, must have remarked my preoccupation, for my second sense of hearing was alert to what was being said by the group of which the girl in white was the center, when I heard her say, "I think his playing of Chopin is exquisite." And one of my friends in the group replied, "You haven't met him? Allow me." Then turning to me, "Old man, when you have a moment, I wish you to meet Ms." I don't know what she said to me or what I said to her. I can remember that I tried to be clever and experienced a growing conviction that I was making myself appear more and more idiotic. I am certain, too, that in spite of my Italian-like complexion, I was as red as a beet. Instead of taking the car, I walked home. I needed the air and exercise as a sort of sedative. I am not sure whether my troubled condition of mind was due to the fact that I had been struck by love, or to the feeling that I had made a bad impression upon her. As the weeks went by, and when I had met her several more times, I came to know that I was seriously in love. And then began for me days of worry, for I had more than the usual doubts and fears of a young man in love to contend with. Up to this time I had assumed and played my role as a white man with a certain degree of nonchalance, a carelessness as to the outcome, which made the whole thing more amusing to me than serious. But now I ceased to regard being a white man as a sort of practical joke. My acting had called for mere external effects. Now I began to doubt my ability to play the part. I watched her to see if she was scrutinizing me, to see if she was looking for anything in me which made me differ from the other men she knew. In place of an old inward feeling of superiority over many of my friends, I began to doubt myself. I began even to wonder if I was really like the men I associated with, if there was not, after all, an indefinable something which marked a difference. But in spite of my doubts and timidity, my affair progressed, and I finally felt sufficiently encouraged to decide to ask her to marry me. Then began the hardest struggle of my life, whether to ask her to marry me under false colors, or to tell her the whole truth. My sense of what was exigent made me feel there was no necessity of saying anything, but my inborn sense of honor rebelled at even indirect deception in this case. But however much I moralized on the question, I found it more and more difficult to reach the point of confession. The dread that I might lose her took possession of me each time I sought to speak, and rendered it impossible for me to do so. That moral courage requires more than physical courage is no mere poetic fancy. I am sure I would have found it easier to take the place of a gladiator, no matter how fierce the Numidian lion, than to tell that slender girl that I had Negro blood in my veins, the fact which I at times wished to cry out, I now wished to hide forever. During this time we were drawn together a great deal by the mutual bond of music. She loved to hear me play Chopin, and was herself far from being a poor performer of his compositions. I think I carried her every new song that was published which I thought suitable to her voice, and played the accompaniment for her. Over these songs we were like two innocent children with new toys. She had never been anything but innocent, but my innocence was a transformation wrought by my love for her, love which melted away my cynicism and whitened my sullied soul, and gave me back the wholesome dreams of my boyhood. There is nothing better in all the world that a man can do for his moral welfare than to love a good woman. My artistic temperament also underwent an awakening. I spent many hours at my piano playing over old and new composers. I also wrote several little pieces in a more or less Chopin-esque style, which I dedicated to her. And so the weeks and months went by. Often words of love trembled on my lips, but I dared not utter them, because I knew they would have to be followed by other words, which I had not the courage to frame. There might have been some other woman in my set with whom I could have fallen in love and asked to marry me without a word of explanation. But the more I knew this girl, the less I could find it in my heart to deceive her. And yet, in spite of this spectre that was constantly looming up before me, I could never have believed that life held such happiness as was contained in those dream days of love. One Saturday afternoon in early June, I was coming up Fifth Avenue, and at the corner of 23rd Street I met her. She had been shopping. We stopped to chat for a moment, and I suggested that we spend half an hour at the Eden Musée. We were standing leaning on the rail in front of a group of figures more interested in what we had to say to each other than in the group, when my attention became fixed upon a man who stood at my side studying his catalogue. It took me only an instant to recognize in him my old friend, Shiny. My first impulse was to change my position at once. As quick as a flash, I considered all the risks I might run in speaking to him, and most especially the delicate question of introducing him to her. I must confess that in my embarrassment and confusion I felt small and mean. But before I could decide what to do, he looked around at me, and after an instant he said, "Pardon me, but isn't this—" The nobler part in me responded to the sound of his voice, and I took his hand in a hearty clasp. Whatever fears I had felt were quickly banished, for he seemed at a glance to divine my situation and let drop no word that would have aroused suspicion as to the truth. With a slight misgiving, I presented him to her and was again relieved of fear. She received the introduction in her usual gracious manner, and without the least hesitancy or embarrassment joined in the conversation. An amusing part about the introduction was that I was upon the point of introducing him as Shiny, and stammered a second or two before I could recall his name. We chatted for some 15 minutes. He was spending his vacation north with the intention of doing 4 or 6 weeks' work in one of the summer schools. He was also going to take a bride back with him in the fall. He asked me about myself, but in so diplomatic a way that I found no difficulty in answering him. The polish of his language and the unpedantic manner in which he revealed his culture greatly impressed her, and after we had left the musée, she showed it by questioning me about him. I was surprised at the amount of interest a refined black man could arouse. Even after the changes in the conversation, she reverted several times to the subject of Shiny. Whether it was more than mere curiosity I could not tell, but I was convinced that she herself knew very little about prejudice. Just why it should have done so I do not know, but somehow the Shiny incident gave me encouragement and confidence to cast the die of my fate. But I reasoned that since I wanted to marry her only, and since it concerned her alone, I would divulge my secret to no one else, not even her parents. One evening, a few days afterwards, at her home, we were going over some new songs and compositions when she asked me, as she often did, to play the 13th Nocturne. When I began, she drew a chair near to my right and sat leaning with her elbow on the end of the piano, her chin resting on her hand, and her eyes reflecting the emotions which the music awoke in her. An impulse which I could not control rushed over me, a wave of exultation. The music under my fingers sank almost to a whisper, and calling her for the first time by her Christian name, but without daring to look at her, I said, "I love you. I love you. I love you." My fingers were trembling so that I ceased playing. I felt her hand creep to mine, and when I looked at her, her eyes were glistening with tears. I understood and could scarcely resist the longing to take her in my arms, but I remembered that which has been the sacrificial altar of so much happiness. Duty. And bending over her hand in mine, I said, "Yes, I love you. But there is something more, too, that I must tell you." Then I told her, in what words I do not know, the truth. I felt her hand grow cold, and when I looked up, she was gazing at me with a wild, fixed stare, as though I was some object she had never seen. Under the strange light in her eyes, I felt that I was growing black and thick-featured and crimp-haired. She appeared not to have comprehended what I had said. Her lips trembled, and she attempted to say something to me, but the words stuck in her throat. Then, dropping her head on the piano, she began to weep with great sobs that shook her frail body. I tried to console her and blurted out incoherent words of love, But this seemed only to increase her distress. And when I left her, she was still weeping. When I got into the street, I felt very much as I did the night after meeting my father and sister at the opera in Paris, even a similar desperate inclination to get drunk, but my self-control was stronger. This was the only time in my life that I felt absolute regret at being colored, that I cursed the drops of African blood in my veins and wished that I were really white. When I reached my rooms, I sat and smoked several cigars while I tried to think about the significance of what had occurred. I reviewed the whole history of our acquaintance, recalled each smile she had given me, each word she had said to me that nourished my hope. I went over the scene we had just gone through, trying to draw from it what was in my favor and what was against me. I was rewarded by feeling confident that she loved me, but I could not estimate what was the effect upon her of my confession. At last, nervous and unhappy, I wrote her a letter which I dropped into the mailbox before going to bed, in which I said, "I understand even better than you, and so I suffer even more than you. But why should either of us suffer for what neither of us is to blame? If there is any blame, it belongs to me, and I can only make the old, yet strongest plea that can be offered. I love you, and I know that my love, my great love, infinitely overbalances that blame and blots it out. What is it that stands in the way of our happiness? It is not what you feel or what I feel. It is not what you are or what I am. It is what others feel and are. But oh, is that a fair price? In all the endeavors and struggles of life, in all our strivings and longings, there is only one thing worth seeking, only one thing worth winning, and that is love. It is not always found, but when it is, there is nothing at all in the world for which it can be profitably exchanged." The second morning after, I received a note from her which stated briefly that she was going up in New Hampshire to spend the summer with relatives there. She made no reference to what had passed between us, nor did she say exactly when she would leave the city. The note contained no single word that gave me any clue to her feelings. I could only gather hope from the fact that she had written at all. On the same evening, with a degree of trepidation which rendered me almost frightened, I went to her house. I met her mother, who told me that she had left for the country that very afternoon. Her mother treated me in her usual pleasant manner, which fact greatly reassured me, and I left the house with a vague sense of hope stirring in my breast, which sprang from the conviction that she had not yet divulged my secret. But that hope did not remain with me long. I waited 1, 2, 3 weeks, nervously examining my mail every day, looking for some word from her. All of the letters received by me seemed so insignificant, so worthless, because there was none from her. The slight buoyancy of spirit which I had felt gradually dissolved into a gloomy heart-sickness. I became preoccupied. I lost appetite, lost sleep, and lost ambition. Several of my friends intimated to me that perhaps I was working too hard. She stayed away the whole summer. I did not go to the house, but saw her father at various times, and he was as friendly as ever. Even after I knew that she was back in town, I did not go see her. I determined to wait for some word or sign. I had finally taken refuge and comfort in my pride which I suppose I came by naturally enough. The first time I saw her after her return was one night at the theatre. She and her mother sat in company with a young man whom I knew slightly, not many seats away from me. Never did she appear more beautiful, and yet, it may have been my fancy, she seemed a trifle paler, and there was a suggestion of haggardness in her countenance. But that only heightened her beauty. The very delicacy of her charm melted down the strength of my pride. My situation made me feel weak and powerless, like a man trying with his bare hands to break the iron bars of his prison cell. When the performance was over, I hurried out and placed myself where, unobserved, I could see her as she passed out. The haughtiness of spirit in which I had sought relief was all gone, and I was willing and ready to undergo any humiliation. Shortly afterwards we met at a progressive card party, and during the evening we were thrown together at one of the tables as partners. This was really our first meeting since the eventful night at her house. Strangely enough, in spite of our mutual nervousness, we won every trick of the game, and one of our opponents jokingly quoted the old saw, "Lucky at cards, unlucky in love." Our eyes met, and I am sure that in the momentary glance my whole soul went out to her in one great plea. She lowered her eyes and uttered a nervous little laugh. During the rest of the game I fully merited the unexpressed and expressed abuse of my various partners, for my eyes followed her wherever she was, and I played whatever card my fingers happened to touch. Later in the evening she went to the piano and began to play very softly, as to herself, the opening bars of the 13th Nocturne. I felt that the psychic moment of my life had come, a moment which, if lost, could never be called back, and in as careless a manner as I could assume, I sauntered over to the piano and stood almost bending over her. She continued playing, but in a voice that was almost a whisper. She called me by my Christian name and said, "I love you. I love you. I love you." I took her place at the piano and played the nocturne in a manner that silenced the chatter of the company both in and out of the room, involuntarily closing it with the major triad. We were married the following spring and went to Europe for several months. It was double joy for me to be in France again under such conditions. First there came to us a little girl with hair and eyes dark like mine, but who was growing to have ways like her mother. 2 years later there came a boy who has my temperament, but is as fair like his mother. A little golden-headed god, a face and head that would have delighted the heart of an old Italian master. And this boy, with his mother's eyes and features, occupies an inner sanctuary of my heart, for it was for him that she gave her all, and that is the second sacred sorrow of my life. The few years of our married life were supremely happy, and perhaps she was even happier than I, for after our marriage, in spite of all the wealth of her love which she lavished upon me, there came a new dread to haunt me, a dread which I cannot explain, and which was unfounded, but one that never left me. I was in constant fear that she would discover in me some shortcoming, which she would unconsciously attribute to my blood, rather than to a failing of human nature. But no cloud ever came to mar our life together. Her loss to me is irreparable. My children need a mother's care, but I shall never marry again. It is to my children that I have devoted my life. I no longer have the same fear for myself of my secret being found out, for since my wife's death I have gradually dropped out of social life. But there is nothing I would not suffer to keep the brand from being placed upon them. It is difficult for me to analyze my feelings concerning my present position in the world. Sometimes it seems to me that I have never really been a Negro, that I have been only a privileged spectator of their inner life. At other times I feel that I have been a coward, a deserter, and I am possessed by a strange longing for my mother's people. Several years ago I attended a great meeting in the interest of Hampton Institute at Carnegie Hall. The Hampton students sang the old songs and awoke memories that left me sad. Among the speakers were R.C. Ogden, ex-ambassador Choate, and Mark Twain. But the greatest interest of the audience was centered in Booker T. Washington, and not because he so much surpassed the others in eloquence, but because of what he represented with so much earnestness and faith. And it is this that all of that small but gallant band of colored men who are publicly fighting the cause of their race have behind them. Even those who oppose them know that these men have eternal principles of right on their side, and there will be victors even though they should go down in defeat. Beside them I feel small and selfish. I am an ordinarily successful white man who has made a little money. There are men who are making history and a race. I too might have taken part in a work so glorious. My love for my children makes me glad that I am what I am and keeps me from desiring to be otherwise, and yet, when I sometimes open a little box in which I still keep my fast yellowing manuscripts, the only tangible remnants of a vanished dream, a dead ambition, a sacrificed talent, I cannot repress the thought that, after all, I have chosen the lesser part, that I have sold my birthright for a mess of pottage. The End. Read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.